Hi everyone, I'm Nauman. So I'm a product manager at Stoplight, and I'm primarily looking at the API governance piece. API governance piece within Stoplight here. I know API governance is a term that's thrown around a lot, and it has a lot of different pieces to it. From how your workflow works within your API design, how reviews work, to actually managing and deploying APIs and eventually deprecating them. So there's a lot of different pieces to it. What I really want to get to today is actually automating some of those pieces, and primarily getting into API styles or style guides, and how you can potentially use them as an effective tool to make API governance better in your organization. So before I get started with how to get into actually creating these style guides and using them, I just want to set a bit of context into why we're talking about what we're talking about. And I took a quote from the State of API report that SmartPair does, and and what it says is standardization is the number one challenge that teams building APIs are looking to overcome this year. Now, when we talk about standardization, it's primarily, especially when you go on scale, let's say you're building hundreds or thousands of APIs, how do you make sure that people across different geographical regions and new developers or designers coming in make sure follow similar guidelines, and your APIs as an organization look similar, so that the developer experience is good for whoever's consuming it internally or externally. And API governance, like I talked about, has a lot of different pieces to it, but one general goal that we're looking to achieve with all the processes that we build around API design and development is consistency. You really want to be consistent in the APIs that you're building out. Um, and while there are multiple ways to go about governance, some centralized teams, or pushing it more down to the teams that are building APIs. Good API governance, in my perspective, is more about making the right thing to do, which might be following some principles or some specific guidelines or a workflow easy to do. And how you can make it easy is, I think that's the theme of my what I'm going to be talking about is automation. If you're automating the different pieces of your workflow, you're really making it easier for people whose main goal is to build APIs, make sure that they're doing it right. And from what we've seen from customers within the community, one effective tool to achieve that is setting up an API style guide. Be it if you're a small company just starting out, start with something small and define what good looks like in your organization. And especially if you're at scale, you'd want a style guide out there, much like you might have a style guide for how you develop apps or other things, just to make sure that everybody has a good sense of what best practices and what good looks like in your organization. There are a couple of different governance strategies. What we have seen over the years for large companies, like you'd see Google, PayPal, putting out these API guides, is a large PDF that might be a large PDF that might contain all those different best practices. The problem with that is that, one, there's it reduces the time to market, or reduces the time it takes for you to put APIs out, because there's a central team that has to look at all API designs and make sure that if that style guide is being followed, and feedback is always late in the process. Plus, another piece being people who need to follow these style guides, people who are building out APIs, need to read large PDF documents just to make sure what the style guide looks like. And now you cannot expect everybody to be doing that, and it's just cumbersome general. So the other piece, which has come and gained popularity of late, is automating some of these guidelines. Now you build out these API standards, and we'll talk about more about what these contain and how you can potentially make them part of your workflow. But the general idea being, if you can automate some of these rules, your reviews go faster, because feedback is much faster, maybe within the design environment and within your review process. There's visibility across the board as to what those rules are, when those appear, and it scales well, especially in larger organizations. So the general idea being automate what you can, and it's going to bring you a lot of advantages over time, especially as you scale your program. Just reiterating the point on how important automation is to API governance, and we've seen that across different people that we talk to. All right, so I talked about this a bit, but just to put into perspective, this is Google's style guide out there in terms of API design, and what it is a large website with different topics and how to go about versioning, what naming conventions to follow, what errors, how does Google do errors within the organization. This is great because at least there's an idea out there on what good looks like. But then again, for somebody coming in new or building these things out, they have to go and find the right topic that they need an answer for, and really make sure that they read through it before actually implementing it. Cumbersome, takes time. Now, what you can get to is the automated kind of style guides, which is on the left, what you see is a set of rules. These are built using Spectral, which supports both OpenAPI and AsyncAPI and other JSON things too, or other tools out there like OpenAPI, CLI from Redockley, where you can codify some of these rules and then run them in your CI, run them in your design environment, and get errors as part of it. So if you automate the guidelines itself, it really, like we talked about, really makes your life easier. So you could map what Google has as a PDF into some of these codified rules and run them in your, make it part of your process. Now I've talked about why you should be creating an automated style guide, but the question that is certainly hard to answer in terms of like the complete what should an API style guide include, what everything that it should include. But I'll try and give a sense of some of those things that you can include in an API style guide to make sure that you're achieving the right things. And in my perspective, I break it down into two different buckets. There are two different goals with these guidelines, especially with us as an industry, the API industry, or people building APIs, adopting OpenAPI and Async APIs formats to design these APIs. One goal is to really churn out good API specification documents, be it OpenAPI or Async API, to make sure that the tooling that you're using, you might be using a code generator, or you might be using some other tooling that are documentation generated to power your workflow. So the quality of the API spec matters a lot, and this is one bucket of rules that you can create. An example being some Async API best practices. First of all, you should have validation for your Async API, so you're at least following the right syntax when you're writing these. But then you can go beyond that and say, all right, I want only this version within my organization. That might be the latest Async API version. Using a particular protocol, adding valid examples, making sure the operation ID is unique, and adding information for like who the contactor is for this API and the license information itself. Just you can go through the Async API document itself and say, okay, these fields are really important for tooling, for what we do within the organization with these specs. So you create rules for it. The Async API team has done a really good job of actually creating the Async API rule set they've been contributing to within Spectral. So you can go check it out, which has some of these rules already pre-built. So you can start with them and keep adding onto those to make sure that the Async APIs that you're building are really good quality. Another bucket within this importance of building good Async API documents is maybe you're using a gateway, right? So if you're using a gateway, there will be particular nuances of that, like the Amazon API gateway not supporting one-off within the JSON schema, or some X extensions that you might have for your code generation setup or your gateway setup. Again, you can codify these to make sure that everybody who's building out these APIs is adding these fields within the document, which really helps make sure that the tooling downstream works well. a big goal of building these documents is documentation itself. So make sure to add some documentation rules, like you should always have examples on payloads, add descriptions, what the length of the description should be, maybe add a grammar or a spelling check, just to make sure that the descriptions are not making you're not making typos within the descriptions itself. And if there are any other, if the tech writing team has any other requirements in terms of what good documentation looks like within your organization, you could add those into the rules itself and make sure that the documentation that you're producing is of high quality. This is one bucket, and I think it's really important to build out these rules to make sure that your documents are of high quality and the tooling works well. But then I think where it really gets interesting with these style guides and automating is some building out some API design guidelines. And I would look at it as the first level as maturity level 1, where you're building out rules to make better API, open API, or async API documents, but then going ahead and saying, this is what good API design looks like within my organization. And one bucket of it might be API URLs. Now, every company wants to do it or does tend to do it differently. There's no one right way of doing what casing you should use or what your URL structure should look like. But decide on whatever you want to follow. If you want to follow some particular company, like say you really like how Stripe does it, take those conventions and build those rules out. Like what casing should my parameters be? What should I completely avoid within my URLs? And what the structure of my URL looks like. Now, if you have a good sense on of rules on how your URLs are, anybody who's using your APIs would find it far more intuitive as to what the next call might look like. The next piece, which is always a tricky topic within organizations, is versioning. And while again there are multiple ways of doing versioning within organizations, it's good to at least decide whatever works well for you and codify it. So say if you want to go for path level versioning, or you want to do versioning within headers, whatever it is, make sure that everybody's doing it at the same way. Again, the goal being consistency itself. This is a big one in a bucket that contains a lot. Thus, I have all this. I won't go through all of it, but the general idea being make security a big part of your style guide. And what I've really found helpful is just to make sure that you're following OWASP's top 10, the rules there. You can create those rules and then go from there and say, this is the security scheme we use within the organization. HTTP basic, we stay away from it. We always add limits to our schemas in terms of if a string, what's the limit of it, if there are minimum and maximum properties and objects, just to make sure that some of these basic security concerns don't fall through the holes. They're easy, but they're still easy to miss too. If you have some rate limiting conventions, you should add that too. And this list can go on and on depending on what the security posture of your organization looks like. Error handling is another piece that you can add to your API style guide. Make sure you say in your style guide that you shouldn't be adding errors into successful responses, but also saying that this is what your error object looks like, and what the popular error responses that you want to have always within your API. All right, so these are just to summarize that a bit. There are two different buckets that you can build style guides out of. Go to API documents and then go to API design. Codify both of them and put them into one style guide that your organization, as a general, encourages people across the board to use and implement. But one piece is building these out, and it's certainly a big task to take up. But let's say you've gotten to the point where a style guide's ready. How do you roll it out? The first idea would be to socialize it within your organization using some sort of documentation. Considering this is a machine readable spec that you're building a style guide in, you can probably generate documentation for it and some markdown, put it somewhere where everybody can go find it and look at how style guides look within your organization. This is just one to get the idea of the style guide out there and to have conversations with people who are going to be actually using it, as to if this makes sense or not, especially in their use cases. Now, the next step would be to bring it where your designers or developers are. The idea being, instead of it being a document like we saw with Cool style guide, bring it to your design environment. So let's say you're using VS Code or some other tool to actually build these async API or open API files out. You can bring those errors into the design environment itself. So as people are writing these specs, they can get these errors and warnings within their environment. What this does is it gives real-time feedback, much like you'd have ESLint when you're writing code. It makes it easy for folks to follow the style guide itself. Like we talked about, governance is about making things easier, and this really puts it right where nobody needs to go and look at something to actually follow these rules. And you can divide them into some being errors, some being warnings, just in case of what do you think about this rule and the severity of it. And people can choose to ignore it. This is more encouraging people to use it rather than enforcing it. But then the next bit that you can do is make it part of your review process. So let's say you do your reviews on GitHub, you're following that workflow where somebody changes a spec, makes a pull request. You can run the style guide within the pull request itself. You get errors right there, and then have a conversation around why is this not fixed, or why is this error here, and if we need to ignore it, then have a conversation around it. But the general idea of anything that passes those checks and those conversations can be skipped as part of the review process, and you can focus more on rather more important things. And that's where I get to. Do you still need to review API designs? Yes. But the review can now focus on business capabilities, use cases. So what are you actually building rather than how you're building it, or what the casing looks like, or you're missing out in an error, or not using the right convention when it comes to API design. So more about does this API make sense? Does this solve the use case, rather than focusing on what the conventions might be. So your reviews are more useful, they're faster, and I think building API is much better and faster too with this. Now, a style guide is a really effective tool, and I think one that has good tooling around there to actually start doing this. But beyond that, what else can you do? And these could be separate conversations in terms of governance. But having an improved diff system so that people can look at what has changed as part of the review process in a better way, and some sort of breaking change detection, just so that you're not putting out breaking changes without knowing about them. So make this part of the review process as to a better diff, hopefully not JSON or YAML, and some sort of a breaking change detection. And there are open source tools out there that do that. And then going from there, you can build out a concept of a reusable API components library, which might have models, parameters, headers, error responses that everybody should use, just so that people can get started with it quickly and keep reusing stuff rather than building it out, so that there are 5 different types of errors that your organization's APIs throw. And templates being another, I think, next step. Once you have a style guide, a good sense on what good looks like, you have reusable components, you can put out templates and say async API documents and open API documents saying, if you're building this kind of an API, use this template, get started with it, just to make the process even faster than what it would be without these. Thank you so much. This is what I wanted to talk about. Hopefully it was useful. If you all have any questions, let me know.